Our topic today is how is housing policy connected to climate change, and we're really privileged to have two great speakers with us today. First, we have Justin Wang from Greenbelt Alliance, who is going to be providing a higher overview of the intersections of these issues and how Greenbelt Alliance as an organization has been involved in working in this space. And then we're also really glad to have Councilmember Pat Showalter from the city of Mountain View here, who is a current council member and a former mayor, who's going to be actually able to provide some examples of specific things that the city of Mountain View has worked on during her time on the council, and also sharing some of her experiences of how she got involved in housing issues coming from an environmental engineering background. So, I think today this is a humongous topic. We're only going to really be scratching the surface, but I think that what's most important to us moving forward is that I won't say it's the start of the conversation, because we and many of you have been involved in these discussions for a long time, but we really hope that this is an opportunity to continue to build those connections between folks who are working on housing issues, folks who are working on all the different aspects of climate issues. And so many of us are already trying to figure out how we work better at the center of these issues and how we can collaborate, because I think that we're always working to create outcomes that aren't focused on this issue we can succeed at the expense of this other issue. And I think that we all know that it's only through all of our work together that we're going to be able to address these big systematic challenges that we're all focused on. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Justin, and then Pat will speak, and then after that we will go to some Q&A. So thank you very much, everyone.
Hi. Hey, everyone. So first of all, huge thanks to SB at Home for hosting this great event and for having me. So to reiterate, I'm Justin Wang with Greenbelt Alliance. I'm our advocacy manager, and I'm just going to get right into it. I think I have a pretty lengthy presentation, so I might, we'll see how it goes. So the first thing I wanted to talk to you all about was this intersection of climate change and housing, obviously. And I thought a clear example of that is still relatively fresh in our minds would be those of the wildfires that we saw rage across our region, not that long ago, just 6 months or so. And now typically, Mountain View and much of the South Bay is more of an urban community, and it'll be at less risk of wildfire, which is, and this is all relative, of course. Mountain View is more urban than, say, Paradise, less urban than San Francisco. And of course, the corollary to this is that the highest risk factor for loss of life in home is the location of the house. So, whether it is or is not in the WUI, or the wildland urban interface. So I'm going to share my screen really briefly to illustrate. Hopefully you can all see this. This is the Seifard curve. This is some research that came out. I think Alexandria Seifard is the one that kind of, I think, made this beautiful graph and just pioneered this research. So as you can see, so this axis is fire risk and this axis is housing density. So, looking at this, there's 3 key examples. So this is low housing density and low fire risk. And that is, it's out there in the WUI, but it's very low density. So there's fewer human ignitions. So the actual fire risk is low, but it's also very low housing density. So you're not getting a lot of people out there. Right here where you see the fire risk peaks is medium density housing in the WUI. So this is, the worst that it gets. This is where you have ignitions. There's enough humans to have a high rate of ignitions and the fuel, and there's challenges with suppression because it's farther out. It's harder to actually address those fires when they occur. And right down here, the sweet spot of high housing density and low fire risk is, of course, dense infill development, building within the urban footprint where there's relatively low fuel and the ability to quickly suppress fires when they do arise. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and go back to my face. Hopefully it's an improvement. And yeah, so looking at that graph, it is not to say that other factors like winds and fuel and topography don't play a role, but housing location is clearly the #1 indicator for loss of life to wildfire. Compact communities within the urban footprint are the safest. Not sprawling out reduces wildfire risk. And this is not to say, again, that everyone who lives in the wildland-urban interface is doomed. There are certainly mitigation measures. For instance, Greenbelt Alliance and other great organizations are researching things like the role of greenbelts, parks, open space, green buffers, trails, all these things. If a community has these around them, they can reduce wildfire risk by creating a buffer. And there's also the role that proper land stewardship plays. Prescribed burns or indigenous burns, given that they were the original stewards of the land, are growing more popular. Cal Fire and the timber industry, they're pushing hard on thinning and vegetation removal. And there's certainly things that can be done, as well as, on a very individual scale, home hardening, which is the reduction of flammable materials within a certain perimeter, typically say 5 feet around your house. Fun facts, maybe not so fun actually, but it's actually not that common for a house to just be engulfed by a wall of flames. But often the ignition point comes from embers landing on things like flammable welcome mats or just dry debris. So if you do have a straw welcome mat or one of those really cute ones, maybe reconsider if you're in the WUI, because that could actually make your home safer. So all of that is to say is that there are certainly things we can do to mitigate fire risk when we sprawl. But at the end of the day, there's no single one that is as effective as simply not sprawling out in the first place. And at this point, I'm sure you're all saying, we get it, don't sprawl. It's not a sustainable solution to the housing crisis, but we clearly need more housing. So where do we put it? And that is a great question. Thank you so much for teeing that up for me, imaginary inquisitive audience member. So, however, if you've been paying attention, you'll recall that we already saw the answer when we looked at the SIFARD curve. And the answer is, of course, to build within the existing urban footprints of our cities, or infill development. Now, why I couldn't have had a more attentive fictional audience member to move this presentation along, I couldn't tell you. But Justin, you say, I get what you're saying, but I just don't care that much about natural and working lands or the risk of people losing everything they own in a fiery blaze or human life. Can you give me some more reasons why I should care about infill development? Well, you came to the right presentation, and I'm very glad you asked. So let me start by saying that transportation is the largest contributor of greenhouse gas emissions in the state of California and is responsible for 160 million metric tons of carbon dioxide per year, or 36% of the state's total. That share is even higher in the state's coastal cities, roughly 40% of total emissions in the Bay Area. So MTC, or the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, has some really great resources on their website, which I will now try to share with you by sharing my screen. And hopefully you are seeing this. So this first slide is from 2015. It is per capita greenhouse gas emissions from primary sources by county. So, so it breaks it down. You can see the green is surface transportation gasoline, surface transportation diesel. And, there's really two, I think it's pretty clear that the biggest ones here are the surface transportation gasoline. Ignore Contra Costa because they're ruining the point I'm trying to make with their natural gas consumption, non-residential. I don't know what that's all about. But I think that for me, the thing I want to highlight here is just how much of our GHG emissions are really coming from these gasoline, vehicles or single occupancy vehicles. This is per capita, and this is from primary sources. This is by county. So just county as a whole versus the previous was per person. So even though we looked pretty good on this previous one, Santa Clara County below average, Santa Clara County, which Mountain View is in, is actually the worst county when it comes to emissions from surface transportation gasoline, single occupancy vehicles. So this is very, very striking to me personally, at least. I think it's clear to me that if we want to tackle our greenhouse gas emissions, we need to tackle the fact that we're just burning way too much gasoline. And we can do that in a multitude of ways. Let me stop sharing. I've made my point with that. So yeah, given that we've established our emissions, particularly from gasoline cars, are out of control, what can we do? So some studies have shown that more compact development coupled with investments in transit could reduce GHG emissions from passenger vehicles by up to 15%. And that's corroborated by another set of studies partially funded by the EPA, which found that compact development could reduce vehicle miles traveled by 20 to 40%. So, these are some really, really huge reductions that can really be, we can achieve this just by building denser, which we should be doing anyways. And finally, going all the way back to 2005, there was an analysis that found if every available infill parcel in California were developed to its fullest potential, the state would gain 4 million additional housing units, which would have met all projected demand until 2025, while simultaneously sparing 350,000 acres of undeveloped greenfield. To me, that's a pretty clear win-win, right? We protect open space, we protect nature, and we also reduce VMT emissions, and we build housing. So, of course, not all infill development is created equal. And as we encourage and engage in infill development, it is imperative that we think about how we can really maximize the benefits that we're getting from our land. For one, green infrastructure is key. Frankly, my personal belief is that every new development should come with a healthy amount of green infrastructure. We're talking bioswales, carbon sequestering trees that provide canopy cover and mitigate the urban heat island effect, native plants that can provide habitat, and just really so many other nature-based solutions. Now, funding green infrastructure is unfortunately very expensive, oftentimes. Now, the opportunity to fund them can frequently come from new development. By encouraging developers to be ambitious and making sure that the community shows up to make the right asks, infill development has the opportunity to rejuvenate cities and, just places that don't have as much green space as they should. Because we've seen, especially during this pandemic, there are so many reasons that we need to prioritize open spaces for our residents. And finally, not finally, I've still got, buckle in, there's still a little bit more. Another note, as a lifelong Bay Area resident, I still have not so fond memories of the 2011 to 2017 drought. And even though we're not currently experiencing a major water shortage, it is something that we need to be thinking about. Let me pull up my final, actually, one more screenshot to illustrate my point as I talk slowly to buy time. And this is, actually, I meant to show this earlier, but this is showing that we're off track to meet our 2030 and 2050 climate goals by a pretty significant margin. So we should just a little more incentive for us to be doing the right sort of development. And the graphic that I was going to tee up right now is this one. And there's a lot of data here, but the key takeaway that I wanted to have here was that up to 50% of demands are non-potable in multifamily residential buildings, which is just to say that a lot of the times in our residences and in commercial buildings, you can see it's up to 95% there, we're actually using potable water for non-potable uses. And what that means is, so potable water is drinkable water and non-potable is non-drinkable water. And when a lot of the water that you get piped in from the city, it's all been treated and it's all really good to drink. And we're flushing our toilets with that water. And so, a lot of the current infrastructure that we have, we're not actually set up to do anything but that. We don't have separate pipes for potable and non-potable. And so there's this idea of dual plumbing, which allows buildings to use the right water for the right uses. So we're not being wasteful with this really, really critical resource. So that is why I shared that slide, and I will stop sharing it. And yeah, and also speaking of water needs, I would be remiss to not mention Coyote Valley, which I'm sure many of the people on this call know. Coyote Valley is located just south of San Jose and is thousands of acres of open space that provide a crucial wildlife corridor for the canyon, as well as being a key piece of local agriculture. It also sits on top of key aquifers that provide water to over 2 million Santa Clara County residents, meaning that it plays a key role in our region's water resilience. By building housing where it makes sense, we are able to relieve that development pressure and protect the lands that in turn protect us. So ultimately, with this suite of benefits, reduction of climate hazard risks, GHG emissions, building better walkable, bikeable communities, and increasing our overall climate resilience, I think it is clear that building housing, particularly infill housing, is essential as we strive for a better future. And now I think I've blathered on for long enough, so I'd like to set the stage for Pat Showalter, who I'm really, really honored to be speaking here with you. Yeah, I'm done. Thank you.
Thanks, Justin. I feel like each and every one of your slides could probably be its own multi-hour presentation discussion. So thank you for running through so many issues with us. Next up, I am going to turn the floor over to Councilmember Pat Showalter. I think we have some slides that we're going to pull up for her as well. So without further ado, we shall move on to Councilmember Showalter.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. And this is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. So I was pleased to get asked to talk about it. I got interested in housing when I was on the Planning Commission in the 90s. I'm an environmental engineer by trade, and I've always worked in water resources management. I started out as a geohydrologist, a groundwater specialist, and over the years I've worked to the surface. Spent the last 20 years working on restoration of San Francisco Bay and our surrounding steelhead creeks. And now I do a lot of policy work. I serve as the Senate Rules appointee on the Bay Conservation and Development Commission, which is San Francisco Bay's sort of own coastal commission. We're responsible for giving permits for the 100-foot ring of development around the nine Bay Area counties, as well as making sure that someday the Bay Trail goes all the way around. And of course I serve on the Mountain View City Council, and we thought it would be good for Justin to go over sort of, more the regional issues, and for me to talk a little bit more about a specific example where the principles of building for climate protection have been, have been included. And we haven't gotten to build it yet, but we do have a good plan. And that's the North Bay Shore Plan. It's always good to know where you're talking about. So here's the map. The purple area is what we call, it says Charleston Road in the middle. That is the North Bay Shore. That is where Google is. That's where Intuit is. LinkedIn used to be here. Microsoft is right here. This is Stevens Creek. And this is Permanente Creek. And you'll see here that 101 is on one side of it. And the bay, the shoreline park and the bay are on the other side of it. So in this location, you have all the advantages of being near the bay and being able to walk along the bay and in the beautiful area, but you also have the hazards of potential sea level rise that need to be dealt with. The other thing that I think is interesting or important to look at when or to think about when you look at this is, where does public transportation come in? Well, public transportation along 101 is quite literally the Google bus fleet. I mean, otherwise it's cars, right? And our train station is right on Central Expressway, about where that yellow dot is. And you can see that that's quite a ways from the North Bay Shore. So how do you get people from Caltrain to the North Bay Shore for their jobs? How do you encourage them to use public transportation? Okay, the other, go on to the next slide. This has lots of pretty pictures that kind of depict the parts of the plan that we wanted to make sure were included because they're important. But before I go there, I just want to say that kind of intellectually, we all want to think about climate change protection in two major buckets. One bucket is mitigation. And mitigation is, what can we do to decrease our greenhouse gas emissions so that we have less climate impacts to start with. But then the other thing that we have to think about is adaptation. We know that, you know, we are already experiencing some of the impacts of climate change, and we're going to experience more, particularly in Mountain View. We're going to have sea level rise. So what are we going to do about it? How are we going to live with that? We need to, you know, we need to do both. But I think it's, for me personally anyway, it's helpful to think about the two buckets, the mitigation and the adaptation. And I think that in particular in the Bay Area, we are doing a pretty good job on getting going on the greenhouse gas reduction, so the mitigation. But we're really just getting started on the adaptation, and we need to do, you know, we need to do both. Okay, so for North Bay Shore, things that we wanted to make sure were included. North Bay Shore is currently an industrial site, and it was developed in the late 60s. Before that, it was kind of a few farms and frankly a big dump. And there was fill put in to make Shoreline Park and to make Shoreline Park over the dump, and that raised the ground surface 9 feet, which turns out to have been brilliant from a sea level rise perspective, for protecting the, you know, the development internally. And but going forward, we realized that it's not good to have the public transportation so far away. People need to be to live close to where they work in order to, I mean, the way to reduce traffic is to have people live close to where they work and live close to public transit. Well, because the public transit system was already built before this went in, that really wasn't a part, something we could do here. So, but what we can do is we can add housing, and housing had not been part of this at all. There is one mobile home park, but that's pretty much it. Everything else is buildings, and literally thousands of people work in the North Bay Shore every day, except during COVID. And I'm sure it's, well, it's still probably thousands, but it's not tens of thousands as it is normally. So anyway, we want to, just going through these pictures, we want to have active transportation. Here's a guy on a bike. We want people to walk. We are adjacent to the Pacific Flyway, so we want to have people, we want to make sure that that is protected, that the birds are protected, and because of that, we put in avian standards for the development of the buildings. We worked with the Audubon Society to do that, and we want to make sure that the creek corridors are protected and there's enough setbacks. We want to have an activated, the center one, we want to have activated living areas, places where people are happy to walk. And then we want to have lots of shade, so trees, and those trees need to be climate friendly trees. We know that some of the trees that we have down there now are beautiful redwoods, but that's really not where redwoods would normally be. So we're trying to put plants that would have normally been there, and also plants that will be happy moving forward as our climate changes. Our plant palette is going to have to change a little bit over the next 50 years. We instigated we have a traffic demand management program that includes shuttle buses to help people get around. And here's a picture of a residential building that we we want to have lots of residents. In fact, one of the things and then bioretention. Justin mentioned that we have one of the most beautiful bioretention areas probably in the world that Google has built, and it is designed to essentially collect and filter most of the stormwater from this area. So then we divided this. Go to the next slide, please. We divided the plan into areas that are for different purposes, with the idea that some areas would be more neighborhood centric. Some neighborhoods would be, there would be a gateway where there would be more entertainment, and that these would all integrate together. You can see here, you can see this with the colors, and the plan so that's just kind of the general background of it. And you'll see that if you're familiar with this area anyway, you'll see that this has more streets on it than we currently have. And the idea with having more streets is to make it more friendly for people to walk and bike. So, because having more human-based blocks is more conducive to people walking and biking. So next slide. The thing I'm most proud of is that we have 9850 units in this zoning plan. Now, we all know there's a big difference between the zoning plan and what actually gets built. But if you don't have it zoned, you don't have it built. This was the result of and really a huge controversy in Mountain View. When the general plan was completed in 2014, they decided not to include housing in the North Bay Shore. And there were a number of housing advocates that ran for council, me being one of them. And really our platform was that there needed to be housing in the North Bay Shore. And I think that the people of Mountain View sort of agreed that, definitely agreed, because all of the people elected had that as part of their platform. And so one of the first things that we did after taking office was to ask for the general plan to be reevaluated on this issue, and for the necessary environmental and transportation investigations to be done to identify how much housing could be put here, at the same time protecting our birds, protecting, making sure that the emissions were low enough, just all the things that needed to be done. There's some things that we include in the North Bay Shore plan that I'm proud to have had a hand in. One is dual plumbing. Throughout the North Bay Shore plan, everything has to be plumbed for dual plumbing. We do have recycled water in this area, and our system currently isn't quite good enough for all uses because it's too salty. So we're in the process of figuring out treatment methodologies and getting them implemented so that the recycled water is high enough quality to really be a good product. But that said, everything that's built in the North Bay Shore has to be dual plumbed. And all, as you saw on the on one of the graphs that Justin has, 95% of the water that's used in an office building is non-potable. So that's really important. And if you put the dual plumbing in as you're building it, it's not really very expensive to change the hookups when recycled water that's good enough quality is available. If you do not do the dual plumbing initially, it costs a lot, and people are just not willing to do that. So that, I hope, would be a takeaway that you take to your back to your other community, is to require dual plumbing as much as possible, just as something that will be useful in the future. In Mountain View, if you're building anything that's more than 25,000 square feet anywhere in our community, it has to be dual plumbed. Even though our recycled water system doesn't go that far yet, but it's just something we know we'll need. Another aspect that I want to talk about a little bit is sea level rise. Unfortunately, I do not have a picture for this, but you can, Mountain View did in 2012 get a consultant to do a report on the sea level rise protections that were needed to to protect us against what was expected to happen before 2050 and 2100. And there were a number of projects that were identified for that, and we've started working on them, but we haven't finished. And as time has gone on, of course, the situation's gotten worse. So that report is being redone, and it'll come back to council in a few months, and we'll have to reevaluate what protections are needed. Well, let's see, what was the other thing I wanted to, but the main reason, the transportation, yeah, the main thing that I think that we can't stress enough is that you really need to have housing close to where people work, because it dramatically reduces the vehicle miles traveled. And those vehicle miles traveled are, what cause the emissions. And anything we can do to help with that is really, is really important. Now vehicle miles travel are the standard that you have to consider in sequent analysis, but that has only been true, I think, for about a year. So people are transitioning to that, and it will kind of come to all of us soon. You want to go down? I think I have the vehicle miles traveled. Oh, this is the transport, talking a little bit more about the transportation. You see where these circles all indicate a transportation pickup node, and they're about a half mile in diameter, and that's what people can walk in about 10 or 15 minutes. And so most people are happy to walk that. You can get off your bus and walk 10 minutes or to do that. And that is by having a transportation network that's dense enough and having the housing dense enough, people can live their lives with public transportation. When you don't have that density, it's much more difficult to keep that going. But you can see that throughout most of the North Bay Shore, people would be within a half a mile of major bus routes and public transit nodes. So that's really important. Okay, yeah, VMT. This is something that it's a key metric in air quality and GHG reduction, and it's something that the planners have been working on for many years, but it's finally, kind of the rule. And so it's really an important change from before. We used to use level of service, and level of service was very kind of car centric, because it basically said, how long did you have to sit at a traffic light? And if the number of trips went up, so you had to sit at a traffic light more, that was bad. And the mitigation was to make the street wider. Well, we know that that's not good. So anyway, having this housing dense and in here, we have calculated will reduce the vehicle miles traveled by 20 to 25%. Now, the reason that we don't really know quite how much this will be is because we don't know what the internalization rate is. The internalization rate is basically how many of the people who live in these 9850 housing units that someday will get built will actually work in North Bay Shore. We know that all of them won't, but we don't know how many will. Sort of the low estimate is that it would be 10%. And to me, that seems a little on the shy side. I would think that people would be, people would be excited to live close to where they work. But the highest that is typical, I think in New York City, it goes up to like 50%. So we'll see how that internalization rate actually comes to pass. But that's what's really one of the things that's really important about how well this works is how many of those people would really like to live in this area. Now, another thing that I think is really important about the North Bay Shore and implementing a housing, this is the last thing I'll say because we need to have time to, is just that we have, this area is planned to have 20% affordable housing. So that means that if we get almost 10,000 units built, we'll have 2,000 more affordable housing. That's really important in terms of providing, people to meet the, all the services, all the service jobs that we have. So I'll end on that and say that this is a great topic, and I'm glad that Silicon Valley at Home brought it up, and glad to hear your questions.
Thanks so much, Councilmember Showalter. That was great. I'll say real quick before we jump into Q&A that I think another thing about the North Bay Shore plan that Councilmember Showalter was talking about was it was a great example of where over several years and months of collaborative community work and study, housing advocates, environmental advocates, transit advocates, members of the community were able to come together and eventually all be advocating for a plan that actually integrated many of these different priorities. And it's the kind of model that we want to see going forward because of the fact that this plan that Councilmember Showalter incorporates so many of these pieces. And we're hoping that's going to continue to move forward this year. Fingers crossed there'll be some more progress on that front. Now, moving to Q&A, I think that one thing that came up that I saw in the chat and then a question that came through that I think it would be great to have our panelists reflect on is digging a little bit more into this issue of affordability that Councilmember Showalter brought up at the end and equity issues. So one thing that, if those of you saw in the chat, a comment from John about how we know that very low-income Californians drive less than their wealthy neighbors, and halting displacement of low-income families from communities, building more affordable housing is a crucial part of lowering our emissions. That's one piece that's very interesting. And there's a question in here about how do we design and set housing policies that are protecting vulnerable communities, that are addressing equity issues in our communities, while also still thinking about climate change issues. And I think this is kind of getting at the question about connections between housing justice and climate justice, because we know that the impacts of climate change are disproportionately impacting people of color, lower income communities, kind of all across the US. And as we look at our housing policies, we're trying to figure out how we can create more affordable opportunities. So for people of all incomes, so that people can remain in communities, so they can be closer to work, so they're not in danger of being displaced. And there's that direct connection to climate issues through how far people have to drive and the potential impact of people being pushed out to live in places that are more at risk of impacts of climate change, or are, in a lot of cases, there's all kinds of obviously horrific examples of being closer to industrial sites that have negatively impacted people's health for generations. So I'm curious if maybe Pat and Justin, you could maybe reflect a little bit about some of the connections between some of this work around environmental issues and environmental justice and housing justice, and trying to create more affordable housing for people so that they can stay in their communities, so they can be closer to home and have more equal opportunities in housing.
Yeah, I think one of the big things associated with that is the problem of displacement. In Mountain View, in 2015, 2016, we just saw hordes of people who needed to leave because their rents went up just a crazy amount. 60% of Mountain View people live in apartments. We have the highest rental component in the peninsula. Well, I think in the Bay Area, certainly in the peninsula, besides San Francisco. Anyway, so that really led to the development of rent control. And that's another topic. But I think what it all taught us is that we really need to create affordable housing that doesn't displace naturally affordable housing. And that's what commonly, happens with, or that often happens with infill development, is they take an apartment that, was built in the 60s and it's really kind of outlived its useful life, especially if it wasn't kept up well, or it wasn't built as large as it could have been for the site. And they displace the people that are there and by redeveloping it, and they put in, and luxury apartments are put in. Maybe 10 or 15% of inclusion area are put in, but there's a lot of displacement associated, and that's so negative from a social point of view. I mean, it displaces people, and also so many of the workers that live there are providing services that we really need. I mean, we all need to have, that we all need. And so that's another great thing about using land in these office parks that have always been office, and redeveloping them with houses and office, because it gets people. I mean, it doesn't displace anybody, so it's great. And I think North Bayshore is a wonderful example of that. Moffett Park is a great example of that. In Sunnyvale, I know, David, you've worked on that quite a bit. And also East Wisman in Mountain View is a great example of that. So looking for places that, don't displace people, that's really important.
Yeah, and yeah, Pat, that's incredible. I think you covered just about everything. Just to add on a little bit, I think, and actually another one of the hats that I wear, I'm a member of the Little Sunnyvale, which is, I'm a Sunnyvale resident. It's a local grassroots group, and we host speakers every now and then. The last one that we hosted was actually Dr. Michael Lenz of UCLA, who actually, answered almost that exact question. And the fact is that building more housing, even if it's not explicitly affordable housing, helps keep the price of existing housing from going up. And obviously, I believe that we should prioritize affordable housing as much as we can, but we need to make sure that we're building densely. Like this displacement pressure, that is what's pushing, it pushes people that can't afford it into less desirable areas, which are often more susceptible to climate hazards. For example, people moving to Paradise, like that wasn't, people didn't just choose, they didn't want to live there just because, it was the best land ever, but because that's what they could afford, within their parameters, that was what made sense for them. And by having these really high prices in places where we should be living, like, Mountain View, like Sunnyvale, in our urban centers, we're pushing people out to the fringes where they are more susceptible to climate hazards. And there's that clear connection between, socioeconomic status and race, which is so unfortunate, but that's the reality. We are seeing already marginalized communities being pushed to the brink. And we have a duty to solve that by building affordable housing. And one more thing, just to, as an addendum, another policy that we can set, or rather unset, is that of single family zoning. This is a huge, I see we only have 6 minutes left. I feel like I'm about to pull the pin off a grenade and just leave it in the room. But I just want to talk about this really briefly. In San Jose, there's this conversation about opportunity housing and this opportunity to upzone, 84% of the land in San Jose, 94 by another estimate. But we've already seen Berkeley do this. We're seeing progressive cities across the country consider and approve this. And it's the way forward. We do not need to have this mandate. We're not forcing people, we're not going to get rid of single family homes. We're going to give people the flexibility to do what makes sense for them. And I think that is something that maybe is not easy to do, but needs to be done. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of great questions coming in, so we'll try to get through a couple real quick. So I'm going to give 2 real quick. One is a kind of a technical question for Councilmember Showalter about how are we, in terms of once the sea level rise kind of measures and impacts have been identified, how do we actually bring sources of funding together to address them? And it's obviously a bigger issue than just in Mountain View. And then the second question that I'll pull out real quick for folks is, it's just how do I encourage my city to support infill development, someone asked. So maybe it'd be nice to hear from, there's a technical question for Councilmember Showalter about resources that can be used for addressing sea level rise issues. And then maybe this question about, from the perspective of an advocate and maybe also from the perspective of a policymaker and elected official, what can people be doing to be encouraging cities to support these things?
Well, fortunately, the tax base associated with something like the North Bay Shore is pretty massive. And so that does produce revenue that we can use for building sea level rise protections locally. And also around the Bay, we all passed Measure AA, which I think is it 25 million a year a tax for assisting with restoration efforts. So that's important. That money is very, very important. And then I'm hopeful that with the new administration, there will be a great deal more money associated with flood protection, which, sea level rise is kind of like the basic one that we can use. But the other thing to stress with that is all the sea level rise protections that we build in the Bay Area, or anyway, really, they all need to work together. And they need to be evaluated both on an individual basis and a mutual basis. Just so, as concerned citizens, always ask that question. What is that going to do? What is this project going to do locally, and what is it going to do to the sea level rise problems as a whole? But yes, getting the money for this, it's something that is discussed all the time, and there are lots and lots of ideas, but frankly, there's no clear-cut answer. I think, in a sense, this is going to be a lot like affordable housing projects, where, affordable housing project typically has between 8 and 15 sources of funding. I think sea level rise projects, unfortunately, are going to be like that. But so I hope there's some really smart financial people who want to work on it.
And just to tackle that second question, David, I see we have 2 minutes left. Just from the perspective of an advocate, and just as a resident of my city of Sunnyvale, I think the biggest thing is just to show up. I cannot stress that enough. You have to show up to the meetings, and you talk to your council members, you talk to your electeds, and you make that connection. Even if you don't have an explicit ask, just, if anything, that's when you really want to emphasize when you want to make those touch points. Because I don't think our electeds get enough credit. They do so many things right. And a lot of times when we show up, it's to ask for something. And we need to say, we need to give them the support that they need when they do something that we like. And to give them that political cover, to organize, and to get your other residents, your neighbors, your friends, and get people to show up to these city council meetings and give them the political cover that they need to make these changes that we want to see in our community, I think could not be more important. It is with the utmost pride that I'm part of Livable Sunnyvale. This local grassroots group of residents who are volunteering their time just to make their city a better place. And that's what it takes. It takes people like me, like Pat, like David, not just in our official roles, but as people, as residents of the cities that we live in. We need to start making those asks, because the people that don't want affordable housing, the people that are NIMBYs that don't want to see their city evolve, they are just as loud as we are, if not louder. And it's our turn to speak up and make those asks. So yeah, thanks everyone.
And one thing I'll just share to piggyback on that is that I think that one thing that's really powerful is when we have advocates who come from different backgrounds and different expertises come together to talk about shared issues. And SG at Home has been proud to be supportive of the work that's gone on to preserve Coyote Valley in a way that we as an organization, right, are focused on housing, but recognize the connection between avoiding sprawl and doing infill development and being able to protect those spaces. So we've been proud to be a part of that effort, maybe just in a small effort on the side, but be supportive. And in the same way, we've had many environmental groups like Greenbelt Alliance be instrumental in working on supporting affordable housing developments across the county. And those are the examples where, you know, for cities to see people coming from different backgrounds and expertises to talk about the connections between these things is really important and sends a really strong message, I think. So I see we're at 1 p.m. I know there's a lot to digest here. Oh, we have a poll. We have a poll that my colleague Krithi has put together. If you want to answer a question about this poll, we would greatly appreciate it. I'll just wrap us up here and just say thank you again to our presenters, to Justin and to Councilmember Showalter. Again, this, you know, we know we just scratched the surface. There's so much to do and talk about on this topic. We're looking forward to more discussions on the connection between housing and climate issues going forward. If you have ideas or thoughts about how we can continue to address these things, work together, or have future events, you can definitely send me an email, david@siliconvalley@home.org. I think we can maybe put that in the chat. We'd love to talk more about that and build those relationships. Then, you know, also there's upcoming opportunities. Pat mentioned Moffett Park. It's an area where the city of Sunnyvale is studying the potential for what they're calling an eco-innovation district in an area that's currently all big office buildings and surface parking lots. And we think there are some interesting opportunities there to think about how could we build housing here to help people be closer to jobs, how can we make use of transit, and how can we use the resources of redevelopment to, you know, create more opportunities for open space, to mitigate hazards of sea level rise through natural solutions. There's all kinds of really interesting issues in the connection between these areas happening there. So the City of Sunnyvale is in a study session on this actually next Tuesday. If you're interested in learning more about housing issues, land use, and open space and its relationship to Moffett Park, we're going to be there to advocate about looking at studying how we could get housing and affordable housing to be a part of this area moving forward. And then I'll just also real quick say that the hack is a once-a-month event. So we got another one coming up in about a month. We're gonna be looking at Diridon Station and the affordable housing implementation plan there. It's another important example of transit-oriented development. And there's been a lot of connections and work there done between housing, environmental issues, transit issues, and how can cities plan for a greener future. So, and finally, I'll just say, we're SV at Home as a membership organization. We could not exist without membership support. If you're interested in joining as a member and supporting our work, you can check out our website at siliconvalley@home.org. If Gabby's still in the chat, she'll post something too. But with that, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone. We really appreciate your participation. We hope that you have a great rest of your day and that you have a great weekend.